We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Milestone was to get
Because that
alignment on the LEM
will
platform.
serve to organize
Alignments
and
are
measure the
important.
best of our energies and skills.
We are bending something out.
Hello, and welcome to the Jack Yates Community Forum. I am your host, Michael Watkins. Today, I have the distinct honor of welcoming back one of NASA's most prominent figures. His career began in 1954 when he was commissioned into the United States Air Force. From there, he worked as a flight test engineer at Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. In 1960, this young man worked at NASA's Space Task Group in Langley, Virginia, as an assistant flight director for the Project Mercury. In 1968, he became a division chief for flight control, and his responsibilities included working as a flight director for the Apollo program. He directed the Apollo 11 mission, in which Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. He also met the challenge of safely bringing back 3 U.S. astronauts during the Apollo 13 crisis. In March of 1994, after 37 years of service, he retired as Director of Flight Operations. He has recently published his first book, Failure is Not an Option. I would like to introduce our distinguished guest this morning, Mr. Gene Kranz, Jr. Welcome, Mr. Kranz.
Good morning, Michael, and it's a real pleasure to be a guest of the Jack Yates Community Forum.
Thank you, and welcome back, sir. Failure is not an option is a bold and inspiring statement. How does it relate to what you call the human factor?
The business of space operations involves very high risk, and the tools that we use are leadership, trust, teamwork, and values, and the people who implement these tools, use these tools to implement the missions, are the men and women of mission control. You have to establish a frame of mind that is absolutely positive, one that cannot be defeated. And the best way to express that I will never surrender attitude is failure is not an option.
In your book, you state how difficult it is for you to convey the, quote, intense frustration and near despair of the early setbacks. Would you try to describe this for me?
The early 1960s, the United States was engaged in essentially a Cold War with Russia for the minds and hearts of the people of the free world. The Russians had captured the high ground with the launch of the Sputnik rocket, and this launch had challenged us to become better technologically. Our nation did not have enough young people trained in languages and the sciences, so they established a student loan program to bring young people into the language and science. And very slowly, we got into a catch-up mode. We had to first train the people, then we had to establish the programs, and then we had to build the rockets and the spacecrafts to get on with the job. The Russians were at least 2.5 years ahead of us at this time, and as they were demonstrated their abilities to consistently launch the rockets, we more often would blow up the rockets we launched. So it was an intensely frustrating period, and then John F. Kennedy gave us a dream, and he mobilized the resources of the nation. He said, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. And he laid down this challenge to America. At the time, we were just struggling to get John Glenn into orbit. So this was a marvelous time to grow up in. It was one that was tied with incredible frustration, but also incredible dreams. And we were able to translate that frustration and really make the dreams happen.
You say that you find it hard to believe that John Glenn was launched in 1962. Tell me why the Mercury Atlas 6 mission was so risky.
Well, this was our first manned orbital launch. The Russians had been there before. We had never been there before with a man. And at the time we launched John Glenn, 2 of our previous 5 rockets had blown up. So when we committed to put John Glenn on top of the rocket, the odds were 40-60 that this rocket might blow up. These are risks that in American society today we just wouldn't step up to. So the risks were very high when we launched John Glenn towards orbit. And as we got on orbit, we had a variety of problems that made us again come to a set of choices that also were very risky in bringing him back home, because we thought the heat protective system on his capsule may have come loose, and we elected to come in with the rocket package still strapped onto the spacecraft. It was supposed to be jettisoned, supposed to be gone. And we were concerned that maybe by using this retro-rocket package to hold his heat shield in place, we might have a series of perturbations that could cause the spacecraft to tumble. Or maybe having this retro-rocket package might focus the intense heat of entry, which is in the order of about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that might focus the heat and cause us to burn through. So we had to make a set of very risky choices in here, and frankly, during Project Mercury, I believe all of us that were working expected we would lose one or more astronauts in that very early phase of the program.
Tell me how you felt during Ed White's spacewalk during Gemini 4. In your book, you describe it as a magical moment.
Yeah, it was absolutely mesmerized. The United States had never conducted a spacewalk before, and we had a very primitive camera that we mounted. Actually, we opened up the hatch, and then in the back side of the hatch, we had a C-clamp type device that we mounted this very primitive camera. And this camera, during the tracking station between the Texas tracking station across Eglin, Florida, through the Cape and down through Bermuda, was transmitting information down to the ground stations and brought back to us so we could see it in real time. So this was not only America's first extravehicular activity, but it was also one where we could observe the crew perform. And it was absolutely amazing. I remember a picture of Ed White just floating free in space against this intense blue background of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean as he passed across the Cape. And he absolutely just seemed to be utterly joyous, ebullient, just carefree. And you thought about, here is this guy out in space for the first time, and he is moving 5 miles a second. He's totally free from his spacecraft, only held by the small oxygen umbilical. And he is his own little spacecraft in his spacesuit. And it was something that just, you did these things for the first time, and you were absolutely amazed that A, it worked, and B, this giant step forward that you took. Now, the unfortunate thing about Ed White's EVA, we were completely misled, because EVA was a very difficult thing to do. We were just lucky the first time with Ed White, because the succeeding 3 EVAs almost ended up in disasters, and we almost lost our EVA crewmen. So it was again moving into an environment where maybe we hadn't done enough homework before, but we didn't know it at the time of Ed White's EVA. It was just absolutely mesmerizing to watch that guy out.
During the Gemini 9 mission in June of 1966, you threatened to quit over an EVA flap. Describe how you felt the flight director was just another management flunky.
This was a very stormy episode. I had now flight directed in Gemini from Gemini 4 through Gemini 9. And as I said, the flight director has got the responsibility for crew safety and mission success. When I left the console, I had left instructions that we would not attempt. We had rendezvoused with the target, and the shroud of the target had opened up but had not separated. There was a metal band basically holding it on to our target spacecraft. I had done a lot of studies on this target, and I knew that if we cut that metal band or released it in any way, that these clamshells would open up with incredible force, and if a crew member was in the way, it would really pose a hazard. So the objectives really weren't worth the risk of attempting to separate this. So I'd left the instructions that we weren't going to pursue this EVA further. I then went home, took a shower, ate dinner, came back in, because we used to sleep in the Mission Control Center. We had sleeping quarters there. Came back in and found a whole bunch of the top-level managers in Mission Control Center planning an EVA. And I said, look, guys, this is my business. This is risky. The objectives aren't worth it, et cetera. And this session continued to escalate in a very stormy session. And I continued to pursue this point until the boss, the program manager, Chuck Matthews, turned and he said, look, do it. And so now it was to the point of, I said, okay, I am going to do everything in my power to make this EVA that you want to do safe. But after this, I'm off this job. I'm not doing it anymore. Well, the conclusion was I didn't have to eat my words, because the next morning when the crew re-rendezvoused with the spacecraft, we gave them the plans for EVA. They said, hey, this doesn't look like a good idea to us. I don't think we ought to do it. So the crew actually vetoed this plan that had come up by top-level management, and I wiped my head and said, thank God, A, we don't have to do it, and B, I don't have to quit because I absolutely love this job. So sometimes you tend to put your foot in your mouth when you shouldn't. Okay.
You described January 27, 1967 as a rare cold day in Houston after the Apollo 1 fire. You stated flight control would be known as the words tough and competent. Can you explain?
This was people who grew up in flight test understood the risk. I had and flown high-performance airplane. I had seen people die in Korea. I had seen people die in crashes out at Holloman Air Force Base, where I worked as a flight test engineer. As I said, all of us who came into the early space programs had lived and understood this kind of a risk. In space flight, we had had many narrow escapes in the Mercury and Gemini program, but we somehow pulled it out of the fire. We were starting the Apollo program. We had a very rapid turnaround from the completion of Gemini to Apollo, and we were in mission control January 27, 1967. And our crew members were Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And we'd worked with Gus and Ed in the Mercury Gemini program, and Roger was a rookie preparing for his first spaceflight mission. And the test that day hadn't been going well. We were 1 month from launch, and we were pressing to meet President Kennedy's deadline of getting to the moon by the end of the decade. And we started to press too hard. During the day, we had problems in communications. We had problems in life support. Our test procedures were faulty, and we'd call a hold to the test. We'd write out the new test sequence, and then we'd continue on. And at 5:31 that afternoon, the controllers were startled by cries coming from the spacecraft, and for 12 seconds, we sat there and listened as our 3 crew members died. And it was an incredible shock to the system for many reasons, but principally because we knew we were responsible for the loss of that crew, their deaths in America's first space disaster. And over the weekend, I had a chance to sit and think about what we had done, and I called my teams together in mission control. We have a small conference room in there, and stood up in the front of the conference room, and I said that we did wrong. We were pressing too hard. We had made many mistakes, and from now on, the teams in mission control will be known by 2 words, tough and competent. Tough meaning we are forever accountable for what we do or what we fail to do. Competent, we'll never again take anything for granted. We'll never stop learning. Again, from now on, we will be perfect. And we took those words, and I have the badge, the emblem of mission control. And it talks about several of the principles. There's 4 stars on the bottom. They talk about discipline, talk about morale, they talk about toughness, they talk about competence. The rocket is in the form of a letter I, which signifies the personal commitment that you must have and the commitment to excellence. The sigma is a Greek symbol that you use in mathematics that represents the summation, represents the teamwork. And you notice this I and this we of the sigma tie together. So it shows that a team is composed of both the individuals as well as the collective effort of the team. The motto is achievement through excellence. So after the Apollo fire, after the Apollo 1 fire, we designed this badge, this emblem of mission control, and this became the price for admission to the ranks. discipline, morale, competence, commitment, teamwork. This team would never fail again.
The mission to go to the moon with Apollo 8 was made before NASA had ever flown the manned Apollo spacecraft. Was that the most daring mission ever flown?
I think it was. I think it was probably the riskiest decision. We were now going to, when we decided to go to the moon, we were going to leave the Earth's environment. We were going to trust a spacecraft that had only been flown once before in a manned sense. We had never been able to prove our navigation at lunar distances, our ability to perform maneuvers, and once we went into orbit around the moon, we had a rocket engine that had to fire. There was no other way home except to use this rocket engine. This mission was a mission literally of dreams. It showed the strength of the American character. You know, as the pioneers, I think it must have been, that mission was sort of like when Lewis and Clark and the very early explorers crossed the Mississippi River. They were going into uncharted territories. And they had a mission that they believed was so important that they were willing to accept incredible risk to accomplish it. And again, I think it was exactly the same way. Borman, Lovell, and Anders were crew members in that mission. And this was one of the missions. I was not working as flight director. I was a division chief at that time. In order to run the division as well as operate as flight director, I could only work odd-numbered missions. So I worked Apollo 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. So I again had the opportunity to sit back and watch my team's work. And if there was ever a magical Christmas Eve, it was when we're now in orbit around the moon. And the crew from the spacecraft started reading from the book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created, and you know, and this came as an absolute surprise to everybody in mission control. And at the time they were reading from the book of Genesis, they had a television camera that was looking out at the lunar surface, and then they'd periodically move it and look back at Earth. And it was absolutely the most magical Christmas I have ever spent in my entire life. And this was the first time when humans had ever left Earth's environment. They were now in an entirely different environment, the gravity of another planet. It was magic.
Tell me how the simulation training with the program alarms probably saved the actual Apollo 11 lunar landing.
You're going to be graduating from school shortly. The final training exercise as we prepare for a mission is literally like a graduation exercise, because from there you're now going to move into a mission status, and the next major events you face will be those of a mission nature, not of a training nature. So I always look at this final training exercise as your graduation. Well, the instructors we had as we prepared for the first lunar mission didn't think we were ready. So they gave us a very difficult, complex training run that we blew. And we blew it because we didn't know enough about how the computer worked and what kind of alarms it would send out and what those alarms truly meant. So we studied them overnight, came back in and ran another set of training runs that was literally our graduation exercise. We then moved into the Apollo 11 mission. The third day of the mission, we were preparing for the lunar landing. We were moving down towards the surface of the moon. And exactly the same alarms that we had in the training that we made the wrong decision on came up, and they were sent from the computer. And there are two types of alarms. One is what they call a bailout, where the computer just runs out of time to do all of its work, so it reverts to a priority scheme. If these continue long enough, they turn into what we call a PUDU, which is do program 00, which is the computer will go to a halt and stop working. And if this is happening when you're trying to go down the surface of the moon, that mission's over. The only option you have is to abort. So we saw exactly the same alarms in the actual lunar landing that we saw during our training run. The difference is, training run, we made the wrong decision. Now that we had that experience in training, we made the right decision for the lunar landing. We continued on down towards the surface, and I don't know if you know this, but when we actually shut the engines down on the moon's surface, we had only 17 seconds of fuel remaining. We were that close to making a land abort decision. It was very, very close.
You state that the best day of your life was July 20th, 1969, when at 9:56 p.m. Houston time, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. Would you elaborate on this historical event?
This was, you have to understand the power of the dream that we were given by John F. Kennedy. This dream, when he gave it to us in the early years of the space program, we thought impossible. But again, it was one so powerful, it captured our imagination, it demanded not only the best that we could give, but the best that all of America could give. And we inched up to that final day when we were now going to fulfill this dream. Now remember, Kennedy had been assassinated, so we all felt a commitment to this great leader who had so inspired us. So we were going to accomplish it. So when the got into the preparation for the descent, we literally fought every step of the way to get down there. We had problems in communications. We had problems with the computers we've described. We had navigation problems. We had electrical problems. And then we just about ran out of fuel as we approached the landing. But when we finally shut those engines down, we had fulfilled the pledge that we had made to our now dead president. His dream that he had given us, we had fulfilled. So it was amazing just sitting there and watching. I wasn't working because I had the teams that got the spacecraft down to the surface. Now I could relax and watch what was going on. And the sense of fulfillment, not only personal satisfaction that we had, but basically the satisfaction that as a nation we had demonstrated that what we can dream, if we will give our best, we can do. And I believe it was really intense sense of satisfaction that as a nation we had lived up to our true potential.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
After the explosion of Apollo 13, you felt strong about not using the main engine on the service module, but many system controllers felt you had made the wrong choice. Explain the debate over direct abort.
At the time of the explosion, we were about 50,000 miles from the surface of the moon. And I had two options to get me back to Earth. One option, if I would jettison the lunar module and use the big engine, I could come around in front of the moon and I could be home in 30 hours. The other option, I had to go completely around the moon. It was going to take me 5 days, and I had only 2 days of electrical power with nothing but a gut feeling. And it was just really an incredibly strong gut feeling that says, for God's sakes, don't jettison that lunar module. You're going to need it as a lifeboat. And don't use that big engine because it isn't going to work. And it was just with this gut feeling that you make the decision to go against the odds, go against the fact that you don't even think you got enough fuel to get you back home, you don't have enough electrical power to get you back home. You're gonna go in the wrong direction. And I called the controllers up and say, okay, all flight controllers, listen up. Be advised that all mission planning from now on will go around the moon. We will not execute a direct abort. And these young kids thought this was the wrong decision. But again, their training said that A, we had to make a decision, and B, I was the guy making the decision, and C, those were the people who would implement the decision. So they signed on to do this job that many of them thought was the wrong thing, but they also knew that they were the ones who had to make the right things happen.
I want this mark all the way back to Earth with time to spare. We never lost an American in space. We're sure as hell not going to lose one on my watch. Failure is not an option.
During the re-entry phase of Apollo 13, you felt the human factor had accomplished all it could, and the rest was in the hands of God. Tell me how you cried after you realized that the crew had survived.
The intensity of that mission, I don't think will ever be forgotten. Every second, every minute, every hour was filled with life and death decisions, decisions that had to be made perfectly and which were irreversible. And we had strung these decisions together for days. We had solved the initial problems. We bought ourselves time to think. Then we picked a path to go around the moon. Then we figured out ways to power the spacecraft down. We had to invent ways to navigate. We had to invent ways to clean the air in the spacecraft. And we had strung this set of almost perfect decisions together for the best part of 4 days now. And finally, we were at the entry phase of the mission. The crew is in blackout. And for the first time, we can't help the crew in any way. They're totally on their own. The spacecraft now is delayed exiting blackout. For the first time, we feel doubt, but we pull ourselves up and say, nope, spacecraft's there, it's going to come back out. And then we see this picture on TV in the ops room where we had this beautiful spacecraft under these 3 gorgeous red and white parachutes. And we knew we were almost there. And the emotional release at that instant was so intense that we stood up and then briefly applauded, and then we were sort of embarrassed by our almost exuberance, and then sat back down and went to work. And I think every one of us at the console got very misty-eyed. I was literally crying. There was no way that I could withhold the emotional release at that instant. And I was very pleased that Ed Harris in the movie picked this thing up, because he got sort of misty-eyed too.
Odyssey, Houston, do you read?
Hello, Houston. This is Odyssey. It's good to see you again.
The command module Odyssey is now at the Comosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas. You probably have been there. Do you feel it's at home?
Well, it's home in America. It was interesting at the time of Apollo 13, when people got interested as a result of Jim Lovell's book and the movie. It was over in an obscure museum in Paris, France. And after the movie came out, Americans started asking, well, where's the spacecraft? I'd like to see it. And the Smithsonian had great difficulty letting them know that the spacecraft wasn't even on American premises, and it was really not viewed very well over in France. So they brought the spacecraft back to the United States, and it had not even been restored. It had just was dingy and dusty and dirty and all crudted up. So they sent it to the Cosmosphere, and the Cosmosphere has got an incredible reputation for restoration projects. They built all the models that they used for the Star Trek movies. They built the models that were used for the Apollo 13 movie. So the Cosmosphere took the spacecraft, and when it came back overseas from France, they invited me up here, and we sort of had a reunion, myself and the Apollo 13 crew, with the spacecraft. And then they subsequently started the process of restoration, and it looks just like it came out of the factory now. So it was a joyful reunion. The other interesting thing about the Cosmosphere, they are the ones who recovered this Liberty Bell spacecraft, the Gus Grissom spacecraft, the Mercury spacecraft and the Mercury 4 mission that sunk. They recovered it from the Atlantic, brought it back up, restored it, and it's now on a traveling display throughout the United States. Cosmosphere does great work.
Well, thank you, Mr. Kranz. It was nice meeting you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming
Real pleasure
back.
to be here for the Community Forum.
Thank you. I am Michael Watkins, the Jack Yates Community Forum. Until next time.
35 years ago, fly the Atlantic. Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept.
We choose to go to the moon. 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 We choose to go to the moon.